This is not just another YouTube channel, this is where things get real, exciting, and worth watching. If you're ready for content that actually stands out, go ahead and subscribe right now. Trust me, you won't regret it. The morning it all fell apart started like any other Monday. I grabbed my coffee from the kitchen counter, kissed my husband on the cheek out of habit more than affection, and headed out the door 40 minutes before him. He'd been on the late IT shift rotation for 3 months 10 to 7, so we rarely drove together anymore, which I told myself was fine. Which I told myself a lot of things were fine. I badged into the building at Hartwell Financial Group at 7:52, just like always. Or at least, I tried to. The turnstile beeped red. I tried again. Red. Marcus at the security desk, not my husband, a different man, a kind one with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, looked up from his monitor, and his expression changed in a way that made my stomach drop. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I'm going to need you to come with me." I stood there with my coffee cup in my hand and my laptop bag on my shoulder and thought, absurdly, that I had a 9 o'clock meeting I could not be late for. I thought about the quarterly analysis I'd stayed up until midnight to finish. I thought about everything except what was actually happening, because my brain refused to go there yet. Marcus walked me to a small room off the main lobby. 2 people from corporate security were already inside. My badge had been flagged, they told me. At 11:17 the previous night, my credentials had been used to access the executive compensation database, a restricted system that even I, as a senior financial analyst, had no clearance for. I told them I had been home all night. I told them I'd been in bed by 10. I told them I could show them my phone, my Netflix history, the half-eaten bowl of cereal I'd left on the nightstand. I told them I had not been anywhere near this building at 11:17. They were polite. They were also very clearly waiting for someone. That someone arrived at 8:10. My boss walked in, and behind him was the head of IT security, and behind her was my husband. And the look on his face when he saw me sitting at that table, it wasn't surprise. It was something else, something careful. Something calculated. My boss looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. He had been my advocate for 6 years. He had pushed for my last 2 promotions. He had written a letter to the executive committee on my behalf when I was passed over for a role I absolutely deserved. Seeing confusion and something that looked almost like disappointment on his face was one of the worst moments of my life. "Can you explain," he said quietly, "why your credentials were used to pull salary data on 14 senior executives last night?" The silence in that room was extraordinary. My husband cleared his throat. "There may be a simple explanation," he said. "She sometimes asks me to log in on her behalf when she's working remotely. She's done it before." The air went out of my lungs. That was a lie. A complete and total lie. I had never asked him to do that. I had never even suggested it. But the way he said it, so calm, so helpful, so reasonable, I watched my boss's face shift slightly, and I understood in that moment exactly what my husband was doing. He was building a story. He was building it right in front of me, and he was using my own name as the foundation. I looked at him. He looked at the table. "I never asked you to do that," I said. "Honey," he said. And the way he said that word made me want to put my coffee through the wall. "You were stressed about the deadline. You mentioned the database. I mentioned it to you in passing. I said I needed data from it. I did not ask you to access it." My boss held up a hand. He asked my husband to step outside. He asked me to stay. What followed was 3 hours of the most uncomfortable conversation of my professional life. They pulled the access logs. The login had originated from our home IP address, my husband's work laptop, and my credentials, which he had access to because I had, stupidly, kept my passwords in a shared notes app we'd set up years ago for grocery lists and home maintenance reminders. I had never thought to move them. It had never occurred to me to be afraid of the person I slept next to. My boss believed me. I need to say that, because it mattered more than I can explain. He looked at the logs, he looked at the timestamps, he looked at the fact that my husband's own laptop had initiated the session, and he said he believed me. But believing me and solving the problem were 2 different things. Because my credentials had been used, and the company had a policy. And my husband had already planted the seed that I had asked him to do it. I drove home that afternoon on administrative leave, pending a formal investigation. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before I went inside. My husband was already home. He'd been sent home too, though for unrelated IT protocol review, he said. He was in the kitchen making pasta like nothing had happened. Like the world wasn't on fire. I stood in the doorway and I asked him, very quietly, why. He put down the spoon. He turned around. And then he did what he had always done in every difficult conversation we'd ever had. He made it about me. He said I was overreacting. He said it wasn't a big deal. He'd just been curious about the compensation structure because he thought I was being underpaid and he wanted to advocate for me. He said he'd done it out of love, out of concern, out of wanting to protect our financial future, and wasn't it sad? Wasn't it just so sad? That I could stand there and treat him like a criminal for caring about us. I had heard versions of this speech for 4 years. The first time had been about the joint bank account he'd moved my savings into without telling me so we'd have a stronger emergency fund together. I thought you'd be happy. The second time had been about the credit card he'd opened in my name to cover a family emergency with his brother, a $10,000 loan that had quietly accumulated 15% interest for 8 months. Before I found the statement. The third time had been about why we were driving separately now that he was on the late shift, which had somehow become my fault, my coldness, my inability to be flexible. I had believed him, every time. I had apologized, every time. I had shrunk myself a little smaller, every time, until I was a version of myself I barely recognized, someone who checked the joint account daily with a knot in her stomach, who kept her promotion news small to avoid the silence that fell over him when my career went well, who had slowly, quietly stopped telling people at work that she was married because she didn't know how to explain the complicated thing that her marriage had become. But standing in that kitchen, looking at a man making pasta with a wooden spoon, I felt something shift. Something very quiet and very final. I didn't argue with him that night. I sat with my pasta and I thought. The investigation took 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I was at home, and I had nothing to do but think, and what I started thinking about was the pattern. Not just the bank account and the credit card and the access logs. The pattern of my career. I pulled out 4 years of performance reviews. I laid them on the dining room table while my husband was at work. I looked at them the way I looked at financial data, objectively, comparatively, without the story I'd been telling myself layered over the numbers. The reviews before we got married were excellent. Consistently excellent. The ones after, they were fine. They were perfectly acceptable. But the language had shifted. Words like detail-oriented had replaced strategic thinker. Reliable had replaced innovative. The woman described in my last 2 annual reviews was a good, steady, unremarkable employee. She was not the woman who had been on the executive fast track 4 years ago. I called my closest friend at the company, a woman in compliance who had been with the firm for 11 years and knew where everybody was buried. I asked her to meet me for coffee. She sat across from me at a table outside, and before I could say anything, she said, "I have been waiting for you to call me." What she told me rearranged everything. My husband's IT access included the performance management system. He had never touched the data directly, he was too careful for that. But he had access to the ticketing logs, which meant he could see when performance reviews were being processed, who was reviewing them, when documents were being routed for approval. And my friend had noticed, 3 years ago, that every time my review cycle was active, there was a series of IT maintenance tickets that resulted in minor system delays affecting document routing in my department. Nothing provable. Nothing obvious. Just enough friction to make deadlines feel harder than they should. To make the people reviewing my work mildly frustrated without knowing why. She had also noticed that my husband had accepted a consulting project through his brother's LLC that involved a competitor of one of Hartwell's largest clients. She had filed an internal flag about it 14 months ago. She had never been told what happened to that flag. I drove home and I locked the bedroom door and I called a lawyer. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed. They were not clean, they were not triumphant. They were some of the hardest weeks of my life, and anyone who tells you that leaving a marriage, even a marriage that was slowly poisoning you, feels like freedom right away is leaving out the part where you grieve. I grieved. I grieved the version of my husband I had married. I grieved the apartment we'd picked out together, the dog we'd talked about getting, the future I had genuinely believed in. Grief does not require the thing you're losing to have been good to you. It just requires that you loved it once. His mother called me 4 times in the first week. She told me I was throwing away my marriage over a misunderstanding. She told me I didn't understand how hard her son worked. She told me that family borrowed things from each other and that was just how it worked, and that I had always been too rigid. Too focused on things, too attached to stuff. As if my career and my credentials and my savings account were just stuff. As if the $10,000 she'd watched her son charge to my name without my knowledge was just a family favor I was being unreasonable about. The fourth time she called, I let it go to voicemail. I did not call back. My husband, for his part, moved through the separation with a kind of cold efficiency that told me he had been preparing for it longer than I had. He had transferred a significant portion of our joint savings 3 weeks before I filed my lawyer caught it. He had also, I discovered, listed his brother as a co-signer on a personal loan taken out in my name 18 months earlier. That one cost me 3 nights of no sleep and a very long meeting with my attorney. But here is what I want to say about having a good lawyer, and about documentation, and about the fact that my husband worked in IT and therefore had left a very detailed electronic trail of everything he had ever done. The truth, when it finally comes out completely. It does not come out in pieces. It comes out all at once, like a drawer pulled too far from its tracks, and everything spills onto the floor, and you stand there looking at the totality of it, and it is a lot to look at. The transferred savings were recovered. The fraudulent loan was flagged for investigation. The consulting project with his brother's LLC, the one that had gone to a competitor of Hartwell's client, was found to have involved proprietary data that my husband had accessed through his IT privileges. That was not just a company policy violation. That was something considerably more serious. His employment at Hartwell Financial Group was terminated 6 weeks after the morning I was stopped at the security turnstile. Mine was not. The investigation cleared me completely. The access logs, the laptop attribution, the testimony from IT security about how the session had originated from his device, it was unambiguous. My boss stood in front of the executive committee and made the case that I had been the victim of a breach of trust, not a perpetrator of one, and the committee accepted it. What happened after that I did not fully expect. My boss asked me to come to his office 2 weeks after I returned from leave. He sat across from me and he said he had been looking at my career trajectory, and specifically at the period of stagnation that had begun approximately 4 years ago, and he had some questions. He had pulled the performance management system logs himself. He had looked at the IT maintenance tickets. He had spoken to my friend in compliance, who had, it turned out, kept copies of everything. He apologized. Not for anything he had done directly, he hadn't known. But he apologized for the fact that it had happened on his watch, in his department, to someone he had championed, and then, without realizing it, stopped championing at exactly the moment when invisible friction was being applied to her every move. The role of Director of Financial Analysis had come open 3 months before my world fell apart. I had not applied. I hadn't felt ready. I hadn't felt like myself in so long that I'd forgotten what my professional instincts actually sounded like. My boss asked me to apply now. I did. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in November. My attorney negotiated the recovery of the fraudulent loan amount, a fair division of the joint assets minus the illegally transferred funds, and a clause that held my husband, my ex-husband, financially responsible for any future claims arising from his brother's consulting activity that had been conducted under my financial profile. The loan, his mother had been so certain I should feel guilty about the supposed family gift that had been dangled over my head for 4 years as proof of my obligation to accommodate, to share, to be grateful, that was considered during the asset division. The math was not in his favor. I stood outside the courthouse and I breathed the November air, and I called my friend in compliance, and she said, "Get dinner with me. I have been waiting to celebrate you for a long time. I want to tell you about the woman I had become by the end of those 4 years. Because I think it's important to name it. I had been smart enough to see the patterns but too conditioned to trust what I saw. Every time I had noticed something that felt wrong, the account, the card, the reviews, the strange silences, when I came home happy about something that had happened at work, I had run it through his version of reality first. And his version always had an explanation. His version always made my discomfort into a character flaw. Too rigid. Too focused on stuff. Too suspicious. Too cold. I had believed him, not because I was stupid, but because I loved him. And love makes you want to believe the version of events that doesn't require you to accept that the person beside you has been working quietly against you. What I needed, and what I did not have until it was almost too late, was a single person who would look at the pattern with me and say, "No, this is not normal, this is not okay, and you are not overreacting." My friend in compliance was that person. My boss, once he understood, became that person. If you are listening to this and something feels wrong, if the story you're being told about yourself doesn't match the person you remember being, please find that person. Please find someone who will look at the drawer full of evidence with you and call it what it is. I started the director role in January. My first week, I reorganized my team's workflow in a way that eliminated 3 recurring bottlenecks that had been making everyone mildly miserable for 2 years. My boss stood in the doorway of my office on Friday afternoon and said, "There she is." I didn't fully understand what he meant until later, and then I understood completely. I moved into a new apartment in February. It was smaller than the one I'd shared with my ex-husband, but it was mine. Every corner of it was mine. Every key to every lock was accounted for, and there was no shared notes app, and there were no passwords left anywhere they didn't belong. Some evenings I sit at my kitchen table with my laptop and my coffee, and I think about the version of me who stood at a security turnstile with a coffee cup and a laptop bag and felt, for one terrible moment, like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. I think about how close I came to accepting his explanation. How close I came to letting the pasta dinner and the reasonable voice and the architecture of 4 years of small, incremental persuasion convince me one more time that I had it wrong. The ground did not disappear. It just revealed itself to be something different than I'd been told it was. I had been standing on his version of reality for 4 years. I am standing on my own now. It is not as comfortable, some days. It requires more from me. But it holds. It holds completely. I want to say one last thing, for anyone who has a family member or a mother-in-law or a husband's brother who has been the reason you felt like your own life was something you needed to apologize for. You do not owe anyone access to what you have earned. Not your car, not your credentials, not your savings, not your professional reputation, not your sense of yourself. Love is not a debt that can be collected on demand. Family is not a password you are required to share. And when someone tells you that your discomfort with having these things taken from you means there is something wrong with you, that is not love talking. That is control, dressed up in the language of love, hoping you won't notice the difference. I noticed. Eventually. It was enough.